Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Darren Gones. I'm representing the National Rifle Association. My two colleagues over here represent our state association to allay the fears that the chairman brought up prior about not hoping that all the speakers weren't going to be this long. I promise that I'm going to warp speed this. In fact, I'm tempted to almost say what he said. So, and just so you know, as we did when this was on the House side, I've also, for what it's worth, conveyed to our membership that we appreciate the no time limits, and so we've also opted to try to extend a courtesy by not repeating stories, not repeating the same information. And so with that, I'll dive into what I have to say, and hopefully they're all new points. On the domestic violence bills, there are 6 of them that I'm roughly grouping together to expedite this. This is something we've seen in a handful of states. There are some groups out there that are pushing this issue, and I think the reason you get a lot of the hyper-technical problems that Frank brought up is because these aren't always, the boilerplate legislation isn't always a good fit for that particular state. For example, in New Jersey, I was down there and testified on that issue 4 times in the last 2 months, and unbeknownst to them, New Jersey had one of the toughest domestic violence laws in the country with surrender orders, and the time frame was small, and getting your guns back was a problem, but they still ran the legislation. And I've seen a lot of this before, and a lot of the bills before us borrow from that language, and there isn't always a good fit. And I could come up with all sorts of examples that I haven't heard about tonight. For example, what happens if someone's forced to surrender a firearm and it was either reported stolen years ago or the person sold it? I don't believe the bills take that into account. There's several things like that I could bring up, but again, we would just simply be rewriting someone else's bad bill, and I really don't feel like we want to get engaged in that. But I will say, as Frank had expressed, he's talked to one of the bill sponsors. Listen, there's no way that's going to defend someone, especially someone who's a convicted violent domestic abuser. We all believe that they should be facing the harshest penalties out there, and we've said that repeatedly. The 2 things that we're looking at is that, one, there's due process, that the person has some sort of a process. And second of all, that there's a rights restoration process, and that should include getting your rights restored and getting your property back. And that's not always the case. And we've seen that time and time in many states. But again, this goes back to the fact that, is there a big glaring need for this legislation? Now, when I'm studying and doing these bills in multiple states and Google searching and looking at individual cases, it doesn't take much of a Google search to look in the Providence paper and find a case where there was a domestic disturbance. And almost one of the first things that they do, the law enforcement, when they respond, one of the first questions they ask, are there any firearms in the household? If they are, they're taken. There was just a case, I think, that was reported in December of 2015 where there were firearms surrendered, and I'm sure there are many more. It doesn't take much of a search. So I'm not really sure that there's a big problem getting the firearms out of the hands when they're called to these domestic disturbances. And I think it's also very important to recognize that domestic abuse is one of the few areas where misdemeanor convictions and restraining orders are actually included into the NICS database. Most of the things that get you in that database have to include a felony, but domestic abuse is one where misdemeanors get you in there in that database for purchasing disqualification. Now, the question came up before, I think from Senator Jabor, about, well, couldn't someone, they won't end up in the database, but they could go to Massachusetts or somewhere else and buy a gun. Why would they do that? They can go 2 blocks away behind the 7-Eleven and buy it illegally, because if they're going to use this to kill a spouse and decide they're going to murder someone, they're not looking to go to Dick's Sporting Goods in Connecticut and buy a firearm through a legal channel. And that's been our argument all along. So with the domestic violence issues, like I said, as long as there's due process and there's rights restoration, people get their property back, there's a process, we don't have a large objection. In fact, like I said, these gentlemen are working with the bill sponsor, and hopefully we can find some common ground on at least one of these bills. But as it stands, there are problems in that legislation that Frank highlighted, and those concerns would have to be addressed, at least for us to be neutral on that. But moving along, I'm going to next lump in together the two issues that tackle concealed carry, both the school bill and the reform bill. I know what we're going to hear. I've done this for 10 years in 10 states. You hear the same arguments. What happens when a cop shows up? How do they differentiate the good guys from the bad guys? Senator Archambault asked a couple questions like that. And ladies and gentlemen, this is a debate we had in this country 30 years ago. In the mid-1980s, Florida became the first state to pass concealed carry. Over the last 3 decades, all 50 states have adopted bills. 42 states are shall issue. Vermont has no issued permit, so they're 43. They would be considered a shall issue or a permit-friendly state. There are 12-point-something million concealed carry permit holders, approaching 13 million, as Mike pointed out earlier. So there's a large body of evidence here to show that all these doomsday scenarios, the blood in the street, the wild, wild west, people shooting their neighbor, I can go on and on. They simply don't happen. And the way that you can look at this, I believe the question was Senator Archambault asked about a concealed carry permit holder who may collateral damage, essentially. So what you should look at, and there are studies.
I beg to differ with you. I can take you several corners and right down the end of my street, or a block and a half away, or 2 blocks, either direction, and show you where someone's been murdered, where they have the candles and the little monuments for that. So be careful, because in some of our neighborhoods, it's completely different than what you see. What I see and what you see is 2 different things. I understand that you're representing the national, but please don't downplay the violence that's taking place in my neighborhood. I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, with all due respect, I think that we were talking about 2 different things. I'm talking about concealed carry permit holders, and the studies that are available out there, what they do is they match it against police officers. For example, when you talk about are there concealed carry permit holders who have had their permits revoked for one cause or another. By the way, most of them are revoked for, if they are revoked, it's a very small number, and it's for something not gun related like a DUI. But what they do is if you take a cross sample of police officers who are suspended for misconduct versus general population concealed carry permit holders, the numbers actually show that the permit holders are more responsible than actually the police officers, which goes to show that of those 13 million permit holders, we've had an incredibly sound track record over the last 3 decades with permit holders. And the same goes for what Senator Archambault was getting at, and that are, a concealed permit holder, is there going to be collateral damage? How often do you see where a police officer goes into a situation and an innocent bystander gets injured or worse? It does happen. But again, you have to measure that, the general population against police officers, and you'll see that our guys rank up there just as proficient. And these scenarios, really, they are doomsday scenarios, and you haven't seen the widespread problems. And that's largely the reason you've seen this issue, at least for the rest of the country, move in a different direction. If you're talking about campus carry, if you're talking about the number of states that have eased restrictions, if you're talking about the number of reciprocity agreements, all of those issues, they've all expanded in one direction, and it's because of the success we've had across the country with this. And keep in mind, while we've licensed these law-abiding gun owners, if you look at FBI data, violent crime in this country is at decade-level lows. And so while Senator Metz is absolutely correct, there are neighborhoods that have the affliction of increased violent crime. When you look at across the country, concealed permit holders have been incredibly responsible. And again, I would contend that the violence that he's talking about And it's not to belittle it or dismiss it or anything, but it's very different. I mean, these are not people who have gone to their local police department, submitted photographs, gone through training, gone through background checks. These aren't those people. And there's a plethora of laws on the books, both state and federal, to prosecute them. And with that, I actually exceeded my own expectations for speaking. So I'm gonna wrap it up. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Are there any questions or comments for this witness?
Real quick.
Senator Raptakis.
Do we have statistics regarding those that have committed a crime? Maybe I should address the question to the Attorney General's office when they do come in. Those that commit the crime with the proper procedures of getting the license, et cetera, and those that just buy the gun on the street, stolen gun, they don't register the gun. Do we have those statistics versus those that go through the proper procedures of obtaining a concealed permit or carrying a gun versus those that commit the crime that never went and took the gun course or licensed, bought the gun in the proper procedure?
Mr. Chairman, my best answer to that is that's definitely a state by state. That those data would be state by state.
Or here in Rhode Island, I'm sorry. Just
yeah,
here in the
exactly.
state
For
of
Rhode
Island.
Island, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, but what you would be looking at, where you're essentially asking, is comparing the revocation of permits. So someone who is legally licensed and that permit was revoked versus a murder case or a shooting, drive-by. It would be comparing those two. But when you look at that statistic, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier, is when we hear statistics from the other side talking about revocations, it's important to remember that some of those revocations are not for firearm-related incidents. For example, DUIs. So it is state by state. For Rhode Island, you would have to ask someone more qualified than myself. Maybe someone from the AG's office would have that information.
Thank you.
Mr. Scotia?
Senator Raptakis, I think I can address your issue. From the research I've done, and I don't have it in front of me, I'm just going off memory, in the last 15 years, one concealed carry holder in Rhode Island committed an offense with their firearm, and most people remember this case. It was a police officer and a fireman, and somebody kicked a ball into somebody's yard, and the police officer was already on suspension from the police department and actually shot and killed the fireman. That's the only information I could find in Rhode Island in the last 15 years for a CCW holder who actually shot somebody. It's the only one I'm aware of.
Thank you. Are there any questions for these witnesses? Thank you. The next